Hi, I'm Zach Auwerda. I'm a PhD philosophy student at the University of Memphis, and I'm going to be talking about group emotions. More specifically, I'm going to be arguing that some group emotions are best described using a non-cognitive account of emotions. What does this mean? Well, first, it means I'm not saying that all group emotions are going to be best described using a non-cognitive account. And second, I'm not going to be giving a detailed account of what this model would look like. Rather, I'm merely arguing that some group emotions will plausibly be best described in a non-cognitive way. Right, so with that, let's jump into it. So first, I kind of want to set up the debate between non-cognitivism and cognivism. And to do this, I want to focus on these three characteristics that I think are intuitively present in the way that we speak about emotions. So for example, we can imagine someone saying, "Oh, I'm sorry I yelled at you the other day. I was angry. I couldn't help it." Right? So if we relate that to these three characteristics, right? I couldn't help it, right? This person couldn't help their anger. So in that sense, the anger isn't something they're actively doing. Rather, it's something that happens to them. They're a passive recipient to this anger. And as such, they aren't responsible for this anger. This anger isn't imputable to them as they weren't the one actively doing it. But on the flip side, we also say things like, "Oh, come on, don't be angry. It was just a joke." And this implies that there is some type of activity to emotions, right? That anger here is something that you did, and you shouldn't have done it because I was just joking, right? You have a responsibility not to get angry at jokes. You weren't a passive recipient of this anger, rather you decided to be angry. And this kind of, the former position is where non-cognitivists pick up or get their starting point, and the latter is where cognitivists get their starting point. So with that kind of in mind, let's jump into some of the details. All right, so let's look at a couple non-cognitivist theories. In the James Lange theory, our physiological states are our emotions. So what that means is, sweaty palms, higher heart rate is identical to fear, right? That doesn't cause fear. That isn't caused by fear. It's identical to fear. So that's that theory. Now this other theory, the Satcher and Singer theory, for them, an emotion is a physiological state with a cognitive appraisal or cognitive interpretation. And we'll look at both of these a little more here in a second. So in the James Lange theory, perception, not judgment, causes the physiological symptoms that are our emotions. So, for example, if there were something scary that were to, or something were to slither out from underneath a bush when you were going for a walk in the woods, your perception is what kicks off your physiological response, or aka your emotion. Now what that means is it's not your judgment. So that means your emotions start before you even know what's happening. And that's going to put the James Lange theory heavily on the passive side and not the active side in my characteristics. All right, now let's look at the Satcher and Singer theory. So for Satcher and Singer, the an emotion is a physiological state with a psychological interpretation, and this psychological interpretation is what determines the emotion. All right, so for instance, let's say you're walking down an alley, a dark alley, and a shady figure pops out and brandishes a gun all at once. And you're, at that point, you're physiologically aroused, right? Your body, the heart rate is up, your palms are sweaty, and your body looks around, or you look around your environment, right? You're in the dark alley, you see the gun, and you use that to interpret this physical arousal as fear, as danger, right? Now, important to this theory is that the same physiological state may lead to different emotions. So the same physiological state that you're in the dark alleyway might also be present at a surprise birthday party that your friends throw you. But the difference is, at the surprise birthday party, you see the balloons, you see your friends, smiling faces. You interpret this physical arousal as joy or pleasant shock or something like that, right? You don't interpret it as fear, and that's the difference. All right, so zooming out here, back to our three characteristics we're taking a look at. The non-cognitivists are going to say no. Emotions are not active. They're not something that you do. Rather, they're something that happened to you. You're a passive recipient of these emotions. Now, that means you're not responsible for them, right? If you're not actively doing them, it would be silly to impute responsibility on you for the emotions that you feel. Now, with the Shatter and Singer's theory, I think it's a little more complicated because maybe there could be some partial responsibility to what exactly you pick out of your environment to attribute your physiological arousal. But to say that emotions are completely your responsibility would just not be consistent with their theory. So keep this in mind going forward. And now let's go on to Cognivism. All right, so I have Martha Nussbaum and Robert Solomon up here. I see Nussbaum as pretty similar to Solomon, but a more contemporary, a little more nuanced. I'm going to speak mostly about Solomon because he's an easier foil than Nussbaum. So just so you know. So Solomon talks about what he calls the myth of the passions, or the myth of passivity. Now, what that means is, right, Solomon is arguing that emotions are not passive, right? Emotions are something that we do. And important for Solomon is emotions are the way that we engage with the world. So the world appears to us through our emotions, right? And because of this, he defines emotions as what he calls constitutive judgments. So the way that we constitute the world and ourselves in the world are through these judgments, which are our emotions, right? So for Solomon, if you are constantly angry, constantly depressed, constantly upset with the world or your place in the world, right, you need to change the judgments that you're making, right? You are responsible for the way that you feel about things, or at least somewhat responsible, right? Like, obviously, if terrible things are happening to you, that's kind of out of your control. But all right, so given all that, the Cognivism is gonna fall differently on these three characteristics. So, for Cognivism, yes, emotions are active. They are things that you do. They are not passive. They don't happen to you. And yes, you are responsible for them. Now, a counterexample that kind of problematizes Cognivism is these types of emotions called recalcitrant emotions. Essentially, this happens when you have a judgment and an emotion, and that emotion conflicts with your judgment. So let's, if we look at our good friend Harold here, right, he is obviously making the judgment that he's supposed to be happy, or maybe but obviously he doesn't look. There's obviously something wrong. He's having a conflicting feeling. A better example is one that Cheshire Calhoun gives us in Tess. And so Tess is someone who is raised in a conservative Christian household. She's brought up to believe that homosexuality is unnatural and immoral. But then she goes to college and through dialogue with professors and her peers, comes to believe that homosexuality is neither unnatural nor immoral. So then one day, one of Tess's friends comes up to Tess and tells her that she is a lesbian, right? Comes out to Tess. And Tess, despite making the judgment that this is neither unnatural nor immoral, or maybe she even makes the judgment that it's good, she feels shock and revulsion, right? This conflicts with her judgment. So what do we do with these recalcitrant emotions? In the Tess case, right, it can't be active, right? Tess doesn't want to feel this way. She's changed her beliefs about the matter, yet these emotions are still left over. Right? There are things that are happening to her. She'd rather not feel this way, but she is. So is she responsible for these? It seems like not, right? Because she's made choices that are antithetical to the feelings that she's having. I mean, you might be able to say she's somewhat responsible, but to say that she's fully responsible just doesn't seem consistent with her beliefs. So, and I want you to notice here that recalcitrant emotions pretty nicely match up with where non-cognitivism fell on the spectrum, right? So, if there's if someone or something has a recalcitrant emotion, Cognivism has a hard time explaining it. And it's easier to explain recalcitrant emotions with a non-cognitivist model. And that's ultimately the move I'm going to make at the end. All right, so now let's probably too briefly talk about Margaret Gilbert on group guilt. I just want to say a few things. I borrow some methodological points from her. So one is she rejects aggregation accounts of group guilt. I'm also going to do that. I'm not going to say that emotions are just an aggregation of the emotions of group members. Rather, Gilbert argues that group emotions are sui generis of group subjects, right? So group subjects are the ones that are embodying the emotion. It's not necessarily the members, right? So that means that like a corporation could give out a statement that it's happy despite the fact that all the members of the corporation are sad or something like that. Now here is Gilbert's definition of group emotions. I'm not going to dwell on it too much. I just want to say ultimately Gilbert runs into the same problem that the cognitivists run into, because she is a cognitivist, so she's going to run into the recalcitrant emotion problem that we saw earlier. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that for the sake of time. All right. So now I want to talk about social facts. So in Brian Epstein's book, The Entrap, he talks about these things called social facts. So social facts either have a social object, so the mob is cold, the social object is the mob, or social property. John is impoverished. John's an individual, not a social object. Impoverished is a social property, or both. The mob is impoverished, right? Has both a social object and a social property. All right, so Epstein gives us a kind of some technical terms for how exactly group facts are metaphysically grounded. And I'm going to use these technical terms pretty roughly in these examples because I just don't have the time to really dissect them. But let's take a look. All right, so the example I want to look at is a speech that President Obama gave after the 2015 shooting in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. All right, so using Epstein's terminology here, at the top we have the social fact, right? So here's a quote from Obama: "To the families of the fallen, the nation shares your grief." And I think this was true. I think that overall the nation was grieving in this time. But we can use Epstein's framework here to kind of unpack this a bit. So Epstein talks about these things called frame principles. And the frame principles are just a general way of picking out specific facts that ground a social fact. So for instance, President Obama is able to represent the grief of the nation in this moment because, right, he's the president and he's in the correct physical position, right, up at the podium, and institutional position to represent the nation, right? He meets those facts, and that grounds the fact that he can represent the nation and say that it is grieving. But these frame principles don't just pop out of anywhere, right? We have to agree that the grounding conditions that are set out by the frame principles are a good way of grounding the fact to come. So Epstein calls these anchors, right? So anchors solidify a frame principle as a good method of grounding. So we can think about what anchors the fact that Obama being in a good position physically and institutionally to represent the nation as grieving is the fact that he was voted into office, and and because of that, everyone accepts his position institutionally, right? So in that sense, he's the grounding conditions are anchored. Yeah. That's a really rough sketch of Epstein's terminology here, but I don't want to get too bogged down in the interest of time. So my main point here is that the frame principles or grounding conditions for group judgment and group emotion can be distinct. And what does that mean? That means there's room for recalcitrant group emotions. And as we've said, recalcitrant group emotions are best described using a non-cognitivist model. And because of that, a non-cognitivist model is plausibly going to be the best way to talk about these things. So let's look at an example. All right, so for example, let's take a look at the summer in the United States of in 2020. Right, so there is widespread anger throughout the country, yet the official avenues for judging the situation in America say that it is great. There's a quote from Trump underneath there. I'm not going to read it. And how is this anger grounded? Well, there is widespread protest, right? And how is Trump's appraisal grounded? Well, I mean, he's the president, and does the institutional things and is in the physical position to represent the nation in that way, right? And then we can ask, well, what anchors this? The history of protest has been a good way of grounding dissatisfaction or anger in the country, and people accept protest as a way of grounding anger or dissatisfaction. And similarly to Obama, right? Trump was elected, and therefore his institutional role grounds the fact that he can represent the country because people accept the institutional role because they had some say in it. So my argument here is that the emotion anger versus the judgment great is a recalcitrant emotion. And because we're taking the United States as the subject, this appears to be a recalcitrant emotion, right? Because on one hand, the nation is clearly angry, but on the other hand, the judgment of how the nation is doing by the official ways that the nation judges and represents itself are saying not what we see, right? Are saying that it's great. So I think that a non-cognitivist model would plausibly be a good way of explaining this. And this goes back to Epstein's framework, right? We just have different ways of grounding the way that groups make judgments and the ways that groups express emotions. And we see that. And this example is a little clunky because it's an entire nation and is very big. But I'm trying to locate that plausibility because of the disconnect between how groups express emotion and how groups make judgments. And I see that I'm currently running out of time, so I'm going to end it there and throw up my references and hope you enjoyed the presentation.